All right, for today's Quality Minute episode, we're talking about design and development. We're going to be going through the requirements of the ISO 9001 standard for design and development, and I want to be clear that this applies to any organization, regardless of your size or complexity, regardless of the size and complexity of your project. Whether we're dealing with something as simple as a mouse, which I say simple, but we still have certain radio frequency transmissions to worry about, FCC requirements, the types of plastic that we're using, possibly even allergies to certain materials since this is on someone's hand all the time. So there's lots of requirements to go into this, but it is still a relatively simple component to design and develop versus a much more complex system, perhaps a medical device or construction project where there's thousands of potential components that are involved in it, many organizations involved in the design and development. Regardless the level of complexity that you're dealing with, we have the same requirements, and they're taken straight from the ISO 9001 standard. I like to tell folks that design and development is effectively a management system within a management system. And you'll see what I mean by that. And we're going to go through this actually here very quickly and break this down nice and simply for you. So design and development begins in clause 8.3 of the ISO 9001 standard. Regardless if you're certified to 9001 or not, these are good basic principles that work anywhere for any organization. So as with all things, we start with planning. So we begin in 8.3.2 for design and development planning. I'm not going to go through this verbatim, but do make sure that you follow along and check in with it. In determining the stages of controls for design and development, the organization shall consider, and these are things such as the nature and complexity of the project, responsibilities, the need for the involvement of customers, and so forth. But it begins with a very interesting statement. It says, in determining the stages and controls. So we know we have to have defined stages, we have to have defined controls, and then we've got a lot of things that have to be considered. Sounds to me like the start of a really good project plan if you just take these basic requirements and run with it. So we've identified our plan. Now you might, some of you might recall this whole thing called the PDCA cycle, plan, do, check, act. The idea of inputs and outputs to a process. Just want to say that this is its own management system within a management system because we go straight from planning to determining our inputs. So the organization shall determine the requirements essential for the specific types of products and services to be designed and developed. And then of course we have a list of things to consider, such as functional performance requirements, regulatory requirements, and potential consequences. So we identify what our plan is going to be. We identify what our inputs to this process are going to be. This is all before we actually do any real work. And again, we're taking into account things such as regulatory requirements, such as customer requirements, what the end use is going to be. Then we develop our controls. You know, if you've ever seen kids in a classroom trying to do an art project, or maybe doing crafts at home with your kids, probably what you've run into is if you give a complete blank slate, just draw something. What's the first thing the kid does? Oftentimes they sit there and scratch their head and get mad because they don't know what to draw. But if you give them some simple constraints, I know this because my wife's great at it, is she'll give them certain crafts to do. It may be, this for 4th of July, this week's fireworks, right? And so we give some boundaries for them to work in. As soon as you give boundaries, all sorts of creativity comes out. So it is unfortunately oftentimes our opinion that constraints kill creativity and innovation, which are very essential for a proper design and development process. However, with the right controls in place, with proper inputs and plans defined, you can have a very creative, very innovative, and very well-developed program. So here it says in 8.3.4 for the design and development controls, the organization shall apply controls to the design and development process. Straightforward. We want to identify, and this is my absolute favorite of the whole section, the results to be achieved. It's pretty straightforward. We want to know what the end goal is going to look like before we begin. Once we identify the end goal, this whole idea of begin with the end in mind, then those inputs and those plans can become reality. Some of the other controls that we want to make sure that we put in place and will be documented in the project plan, that these are the controls going forward, is we want to identify reviews that are to be conducted to evaluate the ability of the results. Okay, so we need to define upfront how we're going to review this process all along. Are we going to do weekly reviews? Are we going to do certain milestone reviews? We need to define and document these up front. Then we're doing these in-process reviews. This whole plan do, check, right? So now we're getting ready for some of the act part, and then the controls that we're designing here is we have to define up front, not at the end, verification activities that are conducted. Now, verification is a really fun word, because we have another one here in a minute for validation, and these two are not the same. So we'll go through verification first. Again, let's take the sample of this mouse. So if I have laid out a drawing for this mouse for certain dimensions, for certain material strength, maybe I'm curious about how brittle the plastic on it is, maybe I'm curious how far the radio transmitter goes on this, I can test all of those to see if they met my requirements. So I can verify that I built precisely what I set out to build. That's verification. Verification is all about meeting the explicit documented requirements. You also have to set up terms for how to validate the activities that are conducted to ensure that the resulting products and services meet the requirements for the specified application and intended use. So, purchase this mouse actually very specifically because it's very small, it's very lightweight, and it will fit inside my binder that I take with me on job sites. That's its purpose. On the other hand, I can have a perfectly good and functioning mouse that's twice the size, and that's actually what I have at my desk on a daily basis. Well, it would not fit the intended use that I have. So if I set out to build a very highly portable compact mouse and it wound up being twice this size, it might have passed my verification, but we completely failed validation because it doesn't do what we intend it to do, even if we built it perfectly to our specifications. So, the last piece of this clause is documenting information of these activities is retained, meaning you have no option but to document the results of your verification, validation, controls, and planning. You have no option. It must be documented. There's been a lot of times, unfortunately, we see that these things are not documented quite so well. Then we go into our design and development outputs. And so what's an output? It's the result of the process. So the organization shall ensure that design and development outputs, first one is meet requirements, hopefully a verification and validation test did that, are adequate for the subsequent processes for the provision of products and services. Really funny sounding statement there, but effectively all it means is that this is going to work with the other products and services that it's going to be interfacing with and designed to work with. And then finally here we conclude with the same statement. The organization shall retain documented information. So at every step of the way, we are documenting everything. So you can see here how maybe in the design process we don't have nonconformities or corrective actions that we might in a standard management system, but what we are going to have are design changes, because you'd be hard pressed to find a complex design that was laid out perfectly to begin with and executed flawlessly all the way through without the need for any changes. So that's 8.3.6 here, talks about design and development changes. And we just need to document what those changes are, the results of the reviews that led to these changes, who wanted to make these changes, and why we wanted to make these changes. So if you apply all of these pieces together, you're going to have a very efficient, very functional design and development program that can then work for any complex design or simple design that your organization may or may not have. We'll make sure to list a couple of documents below that we have available free at texasqualityassurance.com that you can download if you have any questions or maybe need help getting started on a design and development plan. And thank you for watching.